Good afternoon everyone and welcome to the Scrutiny Management Panel meeting today. I'm Councillor Scott Pater-Harris, I'm the chair of the panel. I would like to draw your attention to the following, bit of housekeeping, safety information. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at the Queen Victoria statue in front of the civic offices in order to comply with the Portsmouth Cultural Trust Fire Marshal regulations. If you are signed into the Guildhall, please remember to sign out when you leave the building after today's meeting. Today's meeting is being live web streamed. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that the meeting will be live streamed, filmed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room, which is over there. And this recording will be on the Council's website. The camera will mainly capture the meeting participants, but there will be some footage of people entering or leaving the room whilst the meeting is in progress. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they do not wish to be recorded. May I ask everyone to use their microphones provided when they are speaking, because basically the people at home won't be able to hear us. Okay. Right, the running order for the meeting. We'll go for the apologies for absence first. We have no deputations anyway. So far we have Councillor Dowling has sent his apologies, but I believe Councillor Madden is actually going to deputise for him. Is that right, Leo? Good. Councillor Ian Lyon has sent his apologies also, and so has Councillor Galloway and Councillor Stephen Morgan. So we'll move on to members' interests. Do we have any interest at all? No interest at all, great. And we'll move on to the minutes of the last meeting on the 24th of November. Basically, you guys, I'm just going to go through page by page. If you, obviously, I think everyone was here, weren't they, for the minutes of the last meeting, apart from you, Gemma. Okay. Page 1 of the minutes. Happy with those? 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's the minutes. Very easily done. Afternoon, Councillor Sanders. And we're going to move on to the capital programme, which we've got Mr. Chris Ward, the Section 151 officer, is going to give us a presentation. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. As you will all be aware, there's an important meeting coming up on Tuesday, which considers the Council's revenue budget, the level of council tax for the forthcoming year, and the Council's proposed capital programme and new starts, so running all the way up to 2022-23. The administration's proposals will also be considered by the Cabinet, which takes place on the 12th of February as well, which is Monday. So as I'm sure you're aware, the purpose of this session is to give you the opportunity to ask questions really about the robustness of the way in which the budget proposal has been made. It's to make sure that you're content with it, that we've followed proper due process, and obviously if there's any questions that you have, I'll be happy to take those, but obviously the main debate about the recommendations, they're a matter for Council themselves. So just by way of introduction, I plan to take you through 6 elements really, a little bit of financial context, so where has the Council come from in financial terms from way back in 2011-12 to where we are today. Then to take you through the proposals and the changes associated with the current year's budget, so culminating in the revised budget for 17-18. Then I'll take you through the proposals for next year's budget, which is 2018-19, and within that I'll also talk a little bit about the local government finance settlement that was finalised on Wednesday, and I'll talk you through business rates as well and the application to become a 100% business rate pilot that the Council has been successful in. I'll then talk about what the future looks like, so what the Council's estimates of the following 3 years are and the overall budget challenge it faces for that period. Then moving into the capital programme, and obviously I'll sum up and take any questions at the end. So a little bit of history. Many people will be aware that it's obviously it's been a difficult time for local government since 2011-12, and for this council itself, the council has, in overall terms, had to achieve savings and efficiencies of around about £94 million. And the reasons for that are on the scale on the left-hand side. So the red items on the left-hand side, if you can see that, the council has had, the big driver obviously has been the funding reductions from government. They amount to around about £73 million. In addition to that, the council has faced inflationary pressures of around about £18 million and other budget pressures of £17 million, dominated mainly by adults and children's social care. To balance that up, as I said earlier on, the council have had to make savings and efficiency of £94 million, but has also raised council tax over the same period by £14 million. The two things are in balance, and that's effectively how the council has responded to the challenge that it's faced. If we look forward to 18-19, you'll probably also recall that this time last year, when the council considered the budget, the forecast for the council for the following 3 years was a £12 million deficit, and the proposal in that budget report a year ago suggested that as a minimum £4 million worth of further savings should be made in 2018-19. I won't take you're probably well aware of the council's medium-term financial strategy. I take every opportunity I can to put it in budget reports just as a reminder, but its essence is in being able to match in-year income and in-year expenditure over the medium term, but still protecting and pursuing those goals that are most important to the council. There are 4 strands to the overall financial strategy. I won't go through them in too much detail, but it's effectively a strategy that is intended to be an avoidance to cut strategy. So the first 3 strands are all of the potential alternatives that you could pursue as an avoidance to reductions in service. Inevitably, there will be a financial constraint that you have to meet, or a financial target that has to be met within a certain period of time. Those other 3 strands may not have kicked in sufficient time to be able to satisfy all of the savings that are required in a particular period, and therefore you're left with strand 4, which is withdraw or offer minimal provision of low impact services, or service reductions, in other words. So just a reminder, I've already mentioned it, the current forecast for the council, which is the time period starting next financial year, was for a £12 million overall budget deficit. And again, as I said earlier on, that was to be evenly spread over the 3-year period at £4 million in each year. In addition to that, however, there are some existing, as you'll be well aware from budget reports that have gone to Cabinet throughout the year, there are some underlying budget pressures in our 2 key essential care services. Firstly, adult social, coincidentally it's the same figure, but for adult social care and children's safeguarding, they're both trying to tackle an underlying budget deficit of around about £1.8 million each. And there is a narrative within the report that describes how they will seek to address that challenge. So if we recall what happened in the December council meeting, because that really was the precursor to the meeting that will take place next week, that meeting set out the administration's proposals for achieving the £4 million worth of savings that were required and that council had approved the previous February. There was, contained within that report, there was an analysis that described how those savings were arrived at in terms of the categories of efficiency savings, additional income and service reductions. Most notably within those proposals was the just £0.2 million worth of savings that were described as service reductions, or 4%. Also within those proposals were for children's social care to receive full protection. So there's no savings in 2018-19 relating to children's social care. Now, one of the main reasons for that, of course, is because they are still tackling the underlying budget deficit that they have of 1.8 million. And also within the proposals, it suggested that there be a real increase in funding for adult social care, largely arising from two things, actually. One is the flexibility or the opportunity to increase the council tax for adult social care directly, and for that funding to be directly passported to adult social care. And secondly, there was quite a significant, actually, announcement in the national spring budget in 2017 that awarded the council £7.8 million in the form of what's described as the Improve Better Care Fund, which was directly to support adult social care as well. Within that report, it also suggested that there should be that we should base the budget on the budget that comes before you next week on a council tax increase of 1.99%. You'll notice that in the report's proposals itself, the proposal isn't for 1.99%, but for 2.99%. I'll come on to the rationale about why it's 2.99% in a later slide, but in essence, that's to help cover the additional inflationary costs that will be experienced by the council in next financial year. Additionally, in that report, obviously, it sought to suggest that the council should base its budget on the continuation of taking advantage of the adult social care flexibility, or the adult social care preset flexibility. And you'll recall that the flexibility that's been offered to local government was to increase council tax by 6% over 3 years. The first year of that is the current year, and there are therefore 2 further years remaining. In the current year, the council has already taken the first 3%, so there's 3% remaining for the final 2 years. And just to put that in context, 3% is around about £2.1 million worth of income. And again, remember that I said that that's potentially to be phased over 2 years, so over next year and the year after. But if we just look at 2019 alone, the impact of the national living wage on its own will be 1.4 million, potentially, on the council. There are also demand-led cost pressures, which you'll be well aware of, and the living longer population. But also, I refer you back to a comment I made earlier, which is, and the service has got a £1.8 million underlying deficit. So you can see that the cost pressures within 2018-19 alone exceed the amount that is available to be flexibly taken through the adult social care precept. So that's a recap of December, and that obviously sets the scene for the forthcoming budget next week. So the budget proposals next week, they start with the revised budget, so they start with looking at the current year's budget and any proposed changes to this year. So if I take you through the key changes within the report, there are still remaining potential overspends in children's social care and adult social care. The numbers are different from the ones that I've just quoted, which I describe as the underlying deficit. When I describe the underlying deficit, I mean that part of their overspend that will continue into future years. So there are some one-off influences that will change that in the current year, that will change that 1.8 million. So there are potential overspends or forecast overspends in both children's social care and adult social care, 2.4 and 0.9 million respectively. We have planned for that level of overspend, or the council, the administration have planned for that level of overspend within the council's corporate contingency, which will be part of the proposals that are to be considered by Council next week. The other notable overspending area is MMD. You know that's a wholly owned company by the Council, and you will probably be aware of the announcement that was made recently where one of the largest customers of MMD has decided to withdraw. That's Geest, and there'll be particular forecast costs in the current financial year, not only associated with the loss of income, but also the one-off redundancy costs within the year. On the flip side, there are some areas within the budget that are underspending. There is the Whitelink deal, which you'll also probably be aware of, which in transactional terms is described as a sale and leaseback to a pension fund called Canada Life. Now, as well as some of the income that had already been taken as part of the budget in the past associated with that deal, there is also a without going into all of the detail about it, the accounting arrangements are such that we can also make a 2.1 million saving per annum on that transaction as well. The Council's overall corporate contingency, while still providing for adults and children's social care, there are risks within the Council's contingency that we now expect not to happen this year, but potentially to happen next year. So the proposal within the report basically says it's an underspend this year, but slip that underspend and use that funding to support the Council's contingency next year for when the expectation is that those risks will arise. And finally, the Council's Treasury management activities have generated about £0.8 million additional income and lower costs. So if you wrap all of those things up together, there are a couple of proposals that relate to 2017-18 within the budget report to Council. The first one is to make a revenue contribution of £2 million in order to support the capital programme. So when I come to describe the capital programme later on, the resources that are available to spend on capital investment are relying on this £2 million. And there's also a proposal to transfer £2 million into the MTRS reserve, which, if we look at all of the commitments on the MTRS reserve over the next 3 to 4 years, it only has an uncommitted balance of about 0.3 million. And I'm sure you'll appreciate that you can't do a lot in terms of spend to save schemes with just 0.3 million pounds. So they're the proposals, or the main proposals, and the main construct of the 2017-18 revised budget. If we turn to the proposals for the 2018-19 budget, but first of all start with the local government finance settlement, because obviously the local government finance settlement is important when setting the Council's budget. It describes the overall funding from central government that will be available to the Council for next financial year. And obviously local government nationally is still going through the spending reduction programme from central government, and the reduction to Portsmouth for next year from government grant funding amounts to 7.4 million. So that's one of the challenges, obviously, with the 18-19 budget proposal. Very late, only announced a couple of days ago, was additional funding for adult social care. I think it's it's not within the budget report, because the budget report was published before the local government finance settlement was finalised, but there is an additional 557,000 that will be paid to the Council, but to directly support adult social care in next financial year. The other notable elements of the local government finance settlement actually relate to future years rather than 18-19, and the announcement of the shift from what was originally anticipated to be a 100% business rate retention scheme in 2019-20 to a 75% business rate retention scheme. And as I understand it, that's purely about what can be achieved without primary legislation, because, as you will know, the bill was dropped from the Queen's speech that incorporated the 100% business rate retention scheme. At the same time, there will be what's described as a fair funding review. So in very simple terms, that means the government reviewing the way in which it allocates government grant, in whichever form you want to describe it, to local authorities. So in a sense, a redistribution for need. The local government funding system hasn't been touched really since 2013-14. So there's been a period of 7 years or so where inequalities could have arisen through the funding system as a consequence of change in local circumstances. That obviously is, when I come to it later on, that's a big risk factor in terms of the council trying to forecast what the future looks like, because we don't know what the outcome of that, we have no real intelligence on what the outcome of that will be. So the local government finance settlement, it describes the allocations for 18-19, but obviously the council has signed up to a 4-year settlement, you'll recall that, and the 18-19 local government finance settlement is completely in alignment with the 4-year settlement, so no real change. It runs to 19-20, and our expectations are that in accordance with that 4-year settlement, there'll be obviously a further reduction in funding to the council. So over the 2 years compared to current year, that amounts to 13.3 million. Within the settlement as well was the announcement of what's described as the council tax referendum thresholds, which in simple terms is a council tax cap. So you can obviously increase council tax beyond the cap, but you need to have a local referendum to seek agreement from your local electorate for that. So the referendum threshold was increased from last year from 2% to 3%. Now that's largely as a consequence of the rate at which inflation is running at the moment. So CPI, Consumer Price Index, is currently running at about 3%. Retail Price Index, RPI, is currently running at about 4.1%. So as a consequence of those types of inflationary pressures, the government have sought to align the allowable increase in council tax with what is happening generally in terms of price increases in the general economy. There was no change to the social care precept, so that remained intact, so it's still 6% over the 3-year period, which ends in 2019-20. And as I mentioned earlier on, the council has already taken 3% of that flexibility, and there's 3% remaining to be taken over the next 2 years. Business rates. Earlier in the year, local authorities were invited to apply to become what's called a 100% business rate retention pilot. Now obviously this is in advance of the 75% business rate retention scheme, so the government can learn what a 100% or a large proportion of business rate retention scheme might look like. It had to be a scheme that it had to be a scheme that was undertaken in partnership with other local authorities. So it had to be a pool rather than an individual local authority by local authority scheme. And it's a scheme that the government want to see a sharing of risks and rewards from the scheme itself. Importantly, however, the most attractive thing, certainly for local authorities that have had business rate growth, is that the 100% scheme, in simple terms, basically allows the local authorities to retain the government's share of business rates. So the current scheme is a 50-50 scheme, Local authorities keep 50% of the business rates and therefore 50% of growth in business rates. The government currently keeps the other 50% of business rates and the other 50% of growth in business rates. This scheme allows the councils to keep the government's share, but in return has to forego grant funding. But that part of the deal that has to be fiscally neutral only doesn't relate to the growth element from 13-14 up to date. So in practice what happens is that the government share of growth between 13-14 and this financial year goes into a growth pool. So it's just the government share of growth. The other half of the scheme broadly remains intact, so that's as was. And there's therefore now our estimations are that share of growth across all three authorities, so in all three authorities, Portsmouth, Southampton and the Isle of Wight, amounts to 14.1 million. And the authorities in the pool had to design a scheme for how that growth share would be allocated between the three authorities. So described on the slide, and bearing in mind it's on the fundamental principles of sharing risks and rewards, there were other broad criteria that related to it needed to be a scheme that promoted financial sustainability, which in essence means support to services, existing council services, but the government were also keen to see that a meaningful proportion of any growth was reinvested into further growth type initiatives. And they were also keen to see financial stability. So there's a scheme that was devised between the three authorities that suggested, and obviously this was part of the application, that suggested that of any growth, 60% of the growth pool would be allocated to the three authorities based on need. So similar to the way that the current local government grant system operates in the same broad proportions, 30% of the growth pool will be allocated to growth and productivity, and 10% remains in the pool in the event that any of those local authorities in the future experience business rate loss, and therefore there is a cushion and an ability to draw down on that so that there's limited financial instability going forward. The amounts for the authorities are set out in the table. For Portsmouth, it's 3.1 million in direct funding, but also a share of the £4.2 million growth and productivity pot. That's to be determined between the three councils, and 1.4 million stays within the growth pool itself for the just-in-case day. Whilst welcome, the scheme is only guaranteed for 1 year. It's possible that it might be extended beyond the year. If it is extended, it will require two things. One, it will require agreement from government to extend, and secondly, it will require agreement between the three parties to remain in the pool. So, whilst welcome, it's not appropriate for any of that funding to be used to offset savings, because it's not necessarily reoccurring, and if it doesn't reoccur, it just pushes the savings up the following year by the same amount. And therefore you would start to see fairly large spikes in the level of savings that the council would have to meet in the future, rather than a much lower and even profile. So the council tax proposal within the report is for I won't go through all of the detail on here, but it's in your pack anyway. The broad background is, and I'm sure you will all know, that Portsmouth is a low taxing authority overall anyway, probably about 10% below its statistical neighbours. The proposal in the report is for a 4.49% increase in council tax, made up of two components. Component number one, as I mentioned earlier on, is for general purposes, where the referendum threshold is 3%, so component number one for general purposes is for a 2.99% increase, £2.1 million in total and 57 pence a week. for our average Band B taxpayer, but also for a 1.5% increase for adult social care. And apologies, I've just noticed the error on the slide. That says equals 2.1 million. It should say 1.1 million to be passported direct to adult social care to support adult social care services. But the 29 pence per week per Band B is the right number. If we were to look, and if you were to look deeper into the report, you'll see that obviously the Portsmouth taxpayers' tax bill is not just the Portsmouth element, it's also the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority, and their proposals are for Police and Crime Commissioner, it works out at 7.25%, it's £12 addition, and that was their referendum threshold, and 2.98% for the Fire and Rescue Authority, and they had a referendum threshold also of 3%. So in overall terms, it's a proposed 4.73% increase in council tax for a Portsmouth resident. So if we look at the key changes to the budget in 18-19, obviously compared to the current budget, obviously the council experiences inflation. And I mentioned earlier on about CPI running at 3%, RPI running at 4.1%, but also there's the pay award as well, which not yet agreed, but if agreed at the levels currently proposed, is an effective 2.6% increase in pay. In total, that amounts to 3.9 million. Social care precept mentioned earlier on. Tax for it, must passport it, so it's an extra 1.1 million for adult social care. I mentioned the carry forward of the contingency earlier, of a lesser sum actually, but still a carry forward. And MMD, we expect the losses to be £1 million, but it still is a net benefit to the council because MMD actually pays over more than £2 million to the port in income. So there's a net benefit still to the council for MMD. In terms of the main reductions in spending or increases in income, obviously there's the £4 million worth of savings proposals, and the other major or most significant changes is the continuation of the Whitelink transaction that I mentioned on a previous slide. So that deals with the expenditure side of the budget. If we then look at what's changed on the funding side, I mentioned earlier around on when I spoke about the local government finance settlement, a reduction in government funding of 7.4 million. Other main changes in here are that council tax obviously is an increase of, it's £3.9 million in financial terms. Business rate income is up by 5.8, but as you will have heard me say on the previous slide, 3.1 million relates directly to the 100% business rate retention scheme, and therefore, as it's a one-off, should only be used for a one-off purpose. And there's an improvement in what we call the collection fund, which relates to both business rates and council tax, and it's where our forecasts and estimates in the past for what we would receive in income from business rates and council tax have been slightly cautious, and we have a surplus on the fund of £1.5 million. What does that mean in terms of proposals? Well, obviously, because part of the business rate income came from the 100% business rate pilot, the 3.1 million, there is a recommendation in the report to make a further revenue contribution of £3.1 million, and that really is to fund one of the schemes that's in the capital programme that relates to special educational needs places, and they're the places at Redwood Park. And again, there's the recommendation to further supplement the MTRS reserve by a further 2.5 million. So that will mean in total, in both in the budget itself, for 17-18 and 18-19, 4.5 million being allocated to the MTRS reserve to bring it back up to a level that's suitable for its purpose. So they're the main budget changes. If we now get the crystal ball out and say, well, what do things look like beyond next year? And it's not entirely coincidental, but we're looking at a different period now, but the deficit over the new 3-year period, because it's got an additional year on the end, and 18-19 all obviously drops out because we're dealing with that next year. The deficit over the following 3-year period is anticipated to be another 12. It's still anticipated to be £12 million. Now, if you're trying to do a like-for-like comparison between the two forecasts, there's only 2 common years, and the 2 common years are 1920 and 2021, and our forecasts have remained the same for those 2 years, 4 million and 4 million. I won't go through all of the reasons. They're set out on the slide, and obviously colour-coded. Green is positive in financial terms, and red is negative in financial terms. But the key thing about the forecast is that the Fair Funding Review that I mentioned earlier on, which is basically the government funding review, sits right in the middle of that forecast. So it sits in the year 2020-21, and best estimates are our forecast could be out by plus or minus £3 million, depending on the outcome of that Fair Funding Review. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty associated with the forecast, but the way in which the proposed savings are to be spread, and again it's similar story to last year, which is a proposal to evenly spread them over the period. They're spread in a way which means that if the forecast is too pessimistic, for example, then the council has already made meaningful savings towards whatever the deficit is, and it's got sufficient reserves to be able to smooth out any potential spikes in the future. So the council's overall position would be such that even if that deficit is wrong by £3 million, it wouldn't see a spike of £3 million in its savings requirements in any one year. Conversely, if it's too optimistic, then the council won't have made savings so prematurely to have damaged services in the event that some of it comes from service reductions, but to have reduced services too quickly. So the proposal is a balanced proposal about, given the uncertainty that the council has, make sure that there's sufficient reserves in the bank to ensure that in the event that that uncertainty materialises in a pessimistic way or in a negative way, there wouldn't be a requirement for a big hike in savings in any one year. So that's revenue done. If I move on to the capital programme quickly, I won't go through the strategy. That's written in the report, but that's a strategy that the council has had for some time, largely about making sure that you ensure that your statutory responsibilities are covered, that your operational requirements are covered, but you're also targeting your capital investment as far as you can towards both regeneration and income generation and invest to save, because it's actually a key tool in helping you to achieve the revenue savings that the council needs to make over time. I guess the big story in the capital programme is the level of capital resources that are available, which is just over it's about 25.6 million. But there's two big reasons for that. Firstly, there is an absolute critical need for school places in secondary, and the council is forecasting and assuming that in the future, because it hasn't received notification yet, that it will receive at least £10.2 million worth of funding from the DFE for what's described as basic need, which is really school places. Now, it's a risk, but there is a DFE tool that you can use to plot the number of school places that you have and where they are, and it will give you an estimate of what you might receive in the future in terms of funding. So we've done that exercise and we've run through a number of scenarios and iterations, and we feel reasonably comfortable that there will be £10 million coming to the council for school places in the future. The second big one, obviously, is the one that I mentioned earlier on, which is the 100% business rate retention scheme and the 3.1 million. That's a contribution to the overall resources available. And there's a little bit of money in there from portfolio reserves, not much. So the proposals that will be before council for the use of that £25.6 million are set out on this slide. As I've mentioned earlier on, many of them relate to education and to school places. So there's well over 15 million pounds worth of funding towards education and school places. There's a large proportion that relates to regeneration, notably one of them being the hard interchange and something called cathodic protection, but it's protection to the piles under the hard. And there's significant investment in other areas, particularly around household waste collection, wheel bins and so forth. And on transport infrastructure as well, and the three main corridors into the city. I guess if you start to look forward as well, if you start to look forward beyond next year in terms of what the capital needs and aspirations of the council and the city are, there's a table there that starts to describe what the future requirements or future calls against capital might be. And these are just what we'd probably describe as the most essential items. And they amount to around about between 25 and 31 million pounds over the next few years. Now the council only receives probably about 7 million a year. It's quite a gap between what the council's aspirations and requirements might be of 25 to 30 million and an annual sum of 7 million a year. There are obviously options or opportunities for filling that gap. Most of them relate to bidding for government funds. And one of the real requirements when you bid for any kind of government funds, or even let funds for that matter, is that there's always an expectation of match funding. So it's important that the council does always keep back some funding in order to be able to provide match funding. Otherwise it's likely to lose the opportunity of significant levels of grant funding coming into the city. So just to sum up, in overall terms, the revised budget, the proposals relating to the revised budget generally centre around making contributions both to capital that are in these capital proposals here and also to the MTRS reserve. For 18-19, budget savings 4 million, tax increase 4.49%, 1.5 of that for adult social care. The 100% business rate pilot has been a positive for the council and provided funding, but it's only guaranteed for a year. But in overall terms, the council's position is robust and sound financial position. Look ahead to the future, it looks like there's about a £12 million deficit over the further 3 years from 1920 onwards. But big caveat around, we don't know what the outcome of the fair funding review might look like. Could be plus or minus £3 million against those forecasts. And there is a proposal therefore that when we move into the year after the coming year, that the minimum savings requirement for that year will also be £4 million. In terms of the capital programme, I think there's confidence that the statutory obligations of the council have been met. Significant funding for schools, but there is this large funding gap when you start to talk about the future, and the only realistic way that that funding gap will be bridged is if the council is successful in bidding for external funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. Much appreciated. Do we have any questions for the Section 151 officer? Councillor Madden, I knew you'd be first.
No, I was waiting. Could I comment to say that anything I say should not be construed as being party political in any way? Because I've sat around, I think, at least 20 budget meetings where we've seen cuts from whatever the shape of the government has been at national level. So we've seen cuts since the Blair government.
We won't have any comments about committing fraud for £1 million this week, will we? After Friday.
Well, what was that?
G&A, you know, you mentioned about you're going to do it, you do it for £1 million.
Well,
I know you were joking.
Yeah, it just shows you, doesn't it? Here we are with this report, which has got nothing. We had a report on Friday. You're absolutely right. Which I've complained about, which shows us an update, and the other one's about 6 years behind. You know what I mean? In relation to some of these things, well, a year behind in some instances. Chris, I just want to say on the fair funding, we had. When public health got funding several years back, and I was the cabinet member for that little bit, we had this fair funding type thing. Okay. What happened was we as a city came out well out of it, but other authorities like Oxfordshire and what did not. Right. So and I was at a meeting where they were obviously complaining about it, and wanted the whole lot put back in the pot and taken out. And I disagreed, and we won the argument at the end of the day to say no. If you're short, you go for extra money. The problem with the fairer funding bit is that all it will do is, I presume, keep the pot or reduce the pot, and therefore there will be a formula. We had the Barrett formula, didn't we, for Barnett formula for in the past. So we can't expect to see any increase, can we, over the years in relation to funding from central government. That's one point. I have various points. Is that okay? And I've got some. Do you want to deal with revenue first and then capital? Do you want to do it with that?
Honestly, you deal with it question at a time. I think Chris is quite happy to answer the questions, but we'll probably do revenue first, then capital, if that's probably better. Okay, we'll do revenue first.
So we won't see, on that, Chris, would you, and the expertise you've got, and with, is it SIFA or whatever professional body you're all in, do they see somebody coming along with a big white horse at some stage, whatever the shape of the government, and giving loads of money back to local government in any shape or form?
Okay. In terms of the fair funding review, I think, Councillor Madden, you're right. It's just redistributing the same amount of money, but differently across all local authorities. I think that the potential for gain comes out of business rate growth, because my understanding is government isn't budgeting themselves for that share of business rate growth. So there is the opportunity for the size for funding to increase, but I think it's through business rate growth, and I suspect obviously that's a deliberate policy objective. So in terms of the core amount of money available for local authorities, that will be the same size, and I think the opportunity is around business rate growth.
Okay, could I, on the very exciting one, which is business rates, I have to say, if that happens in full in future, but on the figures that you've given us, and you did do a presentation to the group the other night, so I've gone around and read even more. What we have on one of your slides is our allocation will be 3.1, and then we bid for into the 4.2. What's the mechanism for that?
Well, as part of the application that we made, we had to have approved what's described as a scheme of governance, and that had to, in broad terms, set out how the money will, all the different monies would be allocated. In relation to the 4.2 million that's in the growth and productivity pot, I think that will probably be a slimmed down version of what a let process might be when you bid for funding. So it will be, what's the description of the scheme, outline what the economic benefits of the scheme are, what its costs are, how it will be delivered, is it deliverable, and so on and so forth. So I think, but the decision-making part of that will be by the 3 local authority leaders. And so they will consider bids that come to them, and they will determine which of those bids effectively give the best outcomes for the area.
Yeah, fine. It's a strange way of doing it, isn't it? So I'm the leader of the council, I put a bid in, says happen put a bid in for those, we do a bit of horse trading. Will it be based on that? Will it be on that basis rather than a basis of need?
There will have to be. I think there'll have to be a light touch assurance process, because there is mention of an assurance process within the scheme itself. I don't believe it will be a horse trade. I do believe that they will seek to choose those schemes that are likely to generate the largest business rates, because in the event that the scheme is extended, all of the parties would be beneficiaries of business rate increases in any of the areas.
Chris, and it must be my maths here, but on one of the slides we get 3.1 plus a share of 4.2. On another slide, the additional business rate income is 5.8 million. Yeah. How do you work that out?
The total increase in business rates is 5.8, but that bit that's directly attributable to the growth share, that government's pot, is 3.1. So the other element of it is two parts to it. There's the what I tried to describe earlier on. It's really quite difficult to describe this. Is that the existing 50% scheme almost remains intact. So we already get 50% of our own growth in Portsmouth, and that stays with Portsmouth. We then get a share of the government's growth, which is where the 3.1 million comes from. So it's a complicated formula, but the numbers are right.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure you're right, Chris. One of the things that people have been asking me, and I'm going to ask you, because I haven't looked in any detail, is that we're paying an additional tax towards adult social care. And that money that's raised, and we know the amount because you've shown us, actually will go into adult social care. People are saying, how do we know that it's gone in one door and other bits are not going out the other door?
The council has to submit a return to government every year, which has to demonstrate that for example, you have to demonstrate that even before passporting the funding across, that adult social care doesn't make savings any greater than any other area of the council. So you have to pass that test first, and then show that the additional funding on top of that has been passported across. So it is government regulated and government checked.
I just, that's my last bit on revenue, but just something on capital. But just to say that I was reading an article today, I was listening to the telly yesterday, and it's amazing that we still haven't got, the local government hasn't got the message over, that one, there's big cuts from central government, and secondly, there's big hikes in order to cover that, or essential services at least, there's hikes in council tax above inflation. And people think it shouldn't be, most of the people have been listened to, have been commenting, actually can't understand it and think that local government, it's just comment, because I mean, I know the situation. You know, the government, the local council should be much more efficient in what they're doing. And I heard one comment which I found amazing in relation to Capita, that we should be doing more outsourcing. But that's only a comment.
Do we have any more on revenue? We could quite easily go into a political discussion there, but I'd keep that till Tuesday, to be honest. Over to you, Councillor Sanders.
Thank you, Scott. In December 17, the adult social care precept was 3%. It's now 1.5%. The pressures haven't changed, so why have we denied ourselves some income in 18-19?
Well, that's obviously an administration decision. I would have been content either way, because the overall, so long as the council's forecasts were based on the whole 6% being taken, the council's forecasts still remain based on the whole 6% being taken. So in overall terms, the same amount of funding will be available for adult social care. And the adult social care budget position for next year is balanced, and they have the opportunity, particularly with the Improved Better Care Fund, which was 7.8 million over 3 years, to invest that in areas that are going to help generate savings in adult social care.
So that's a new position and was not available in December. That is correct, is it not?
The position in December, the budget report in December wasn't specific about the amount that would be used for the adult social care precept. It talked only about 3% over 2 years.
Okay. My second area is around the council tax and your financial forecast. You've got on the slide behind you, no, you haven't got in the slide behind you, there's another slide which has this year's been revised to 2.99%, and the referendum threshold has now conveniently gone up to 3%. You're budgeting for future years for a 1.99% council tax rise. Do you have any information that the referendum threshold is going to go down over those years, or would your judgment actually be, in the light of different circumstances, that you'd recommend a 2.99% council tax rise and if the referendum threshold stays as it is? And if that's too difficult, I'm happy to do it in diagrams.
No. Well, the first point, let's just deal with the 1.99 to 2.99%. The rationale for that was that the way to be able to keep the savings requirements at 4 million was to be able to mitigate against the inflationary costs. Now, the council's forecasts now are that inflation in 18-19 will be £1.1 million higher than was originally forecast. And so if, in order to keep the savings requirements broadly the same, there was a necessity to increase the council tax within the threshold that was allowed. That generates 714,000, so it's a meaningful proportion towards the 1.1 million. And that's for a number of reasons. You heard me say earlier on, partly national living wage, partly CPI 3%, RPI 4.1%. We've got to remember that a lot of our external contracts are linked to RPI, not CPI, and that's industry standard. And the pay award will be around about 2.6%. So they are all the reasons why there was a change, if you like, in the approach to what the council tax rise ought to be, and obviously there was the change in the threshold. In terms of the future, it's all we can do is we can look back on history and say what were the referendum thresholds in the past, and we can look at what's happened this year. In history, they've tended to be at 1.99% or 2%. Presumably a national politically acceptable level. Currently it's 3% as a consequence of inflation, so the question really is, will future council tax referendum thresholds be strongly linked to inflation? If they are linked to inflation, our inflation forecasts going forward are not too far away from 2% or 1.99, probably about 2.5 to be fair. So if there is a more strong link with inflation, then, and the council elects to take a council tax rise that might be linked to inflation, if that's allowed, then the forecast would improve.
My third area was around the business rate pilot. These schemes that you bid for the growth and productivity pod, are they schemes that have to occur exclusively within at least one of the three areas. They can't occur outside any of the three areas. Southampton, the island, and us. Let me give you an example. If you want to work towards improve the A27, for instance, or we want to improve the Portsmouth-Southampton railway line, which lots of it doesn't go through Portsmouth or Southampton, does that qualify?
There's no criteria to say that it doesn't qualify.
Okay. Okay. That's other councils feeling very happy as a result.
Clearly the incentive is to generate additional business rates in your local area so that you can be the beneficiary of your investment.
No. So there's no bar, no geographical bar on this?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
Okay. The final thing was again around the business rate retention scheme. You've got the 75% scheme that's going forwards. You don't have any, we don't keep any of the business rate growth, do we, if that goes ahead? So let's say the pilot drops out and we just are landed with the 75% rate retention next year.
Yeah, I think a unique feature of the current pilots is that you're allowed to keep the business rate growth from 2013-14. Because the 75% scheme is going to come in at the same time as the fair funding review, it will involve something called a reset, and that essentially means that I keep talking about this baseline of 2013-14. That's a baseline for business rates, i.e. what business rates were receivable in 13-14. I think that when we come to 2019-20, that reset will reset the baseline for business rates, so the growth in effect will be wiped out. The baseline will be reset, and then, but then from there on in, you would receive 75% of all growth from that baseline in the future.
Okay. I think I understand that, Scott. I have a 75% understanding of that, I think, which is basically it's going to be a slightly better position than it is now because the base will be different, the base will be more. Yeah?
The baseline was here, and from that point in 13-14, as we travel forward, you get all growth from 13-14. In 2019-20, the baseline will be reset up here. So you'll then start to receive all growth at 75% from there. But all of that growth that had previously been received will be wrapped up in the fair funding review and redistributed on the basis of need.
Okay,
which
so
we may or may not be a beneficiary of.
Okay, that's a slightly worse position than I'd hoped. But linked to that, you mentioned the fair funding review. Is it fair to say that your £12 million essentially is a midpoint? So it could be 9 million, or it could be, as I think Leo was indicating, could be worse, and you were indicating it could be 15 million. And so
Correct.
£12 million is sort of the basic midpoint of where you think we might need to give the funding gap, basically.
Yeah, it's my central assumption, and it's based on that the council will lose half of the gain that it's already received in business rates.
Okay. That's fine. Those are all my questions, Scott.
Thank you very much, Darren. Do we want to move on to capital now? I will start with you, Leo, because you've made the motion first.
Well, I've just had the one is secondary school places, and given the fact that since I've been on the council, we've created 2 new secondary schools in Portsmouth, i.e. Edwin Lord Nelson and Milton Cross. Although Hampshire did tell us at the time we didn't need a Milton Cross, or didn't need a secondary school, because we could shoehorn kids into other of our schools. I presume this is what this is. This is shoehorning in. This is providing additional facilities or something, rather than a new build secondary school. Chris, is that your reading of it?
Yeah, there's that 10.2 million relates to 2 main schools. It's Admiral Lord Nelson and Charter, but it is additional classrooms. But it's additional classroom space and communal space for both, so that they can accommodate additional kids. So, for example, Charter, I think it will end up having a capacity of about 900 children, which I think in recent times, I'm not sure what the number is now, but it has been as low as 600. Yeah, it's two schools, it's additional classrooms, it's not rebuild.
And I assume since most of these schools are, well, there's 2 academies there, we can still insist that they do it, even if they don't want to do it. Or presumably they do want to do it. Do you know?
Yeah, I think they're positive about it. The difficulty of the local authority these days is that the local authority's got the statutory responsibility to ensure that there's sufficient school places, but they still need to work with academies in order to provide those school places.
Over to you, Darren.
Yeah, just a couple of questions, mainly about the funding gap, which looks somewhat scary, I think, from my limited knowledge. The biggest variable, or the biggest unfunded variable, is the Enabling Transport Infrastructure Match Funding City Development. What is that in English, please, Chris? Is it the city centre road?
Well done. Yes,
Thank you.
It's the
City Centre
road.
road. Lovely. Okay, so basically that's the biggest unfunded variable we've got. Yep.
At the moment, we have, there's been a number of bids submitted for the city centre road. It's a big scheme. It's a £70 million scheme. Currently, the council has set aside 15 million of its own money because, like I mentioned earlier on, match funding is a significant contributor towards those bids being successful. The bids that have been submitted in the year have described the council's contribution as 22.5 million, on the basis that there's a reasonable expectation, but not without risk, that as a consequence of the development there will be community infrastructure levy contributions. And we've done some estimates of that, and it might be around that mark, but because there's risk attached to it, that's why it's shown in that table as 7.5 million.
Okay, so in other words, the 7.5 million
May or may not arise, but it's still a potential funding commitment.
Okay, so in other words, is this in here just to be on the safe side, because
Correct.
still
Correct.
may not turn up?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, that to me was the biggest variable, but the gap remains significantly scary if we're to achieve several of these things. And if match funding doesn't turn up, what would be your recommendation to the administration after May?
My recommendation will always be that you need to, well, there is a recommendation, of course, in the report, but it's not a formally planned recommendation in the sense that it says if there's any underspendings in the current financial year, use that money and transfer it into your capital resources so that you've got the right level of resources, or you're starting to plan for the resources that you are likely to need. That's not a formally planned approach because it's based on things happening that you haven't planned. So I would also suggest that the council needs to start thinking about revenue contributions to capital in order to be able to close some of those gaps. And that also helps you with your funding bids too.
And in what ways would those be able to be provided? Would that mean going above your central savings target in the revenue budget then?
That's one option. Another option is when one-off, we have experienced one-off funding a number of times, and the 100% business rate retention scheme is a prime example, and the recommendation in this report is to transfer it into capital. So it's being really mindful that when those one-off funding opportunities become available, be mindful of the requirements that you have for your capital programme going forward.
And my final question on this, Scott, is just around the modelling that you've done for the school places, or you've done for the funding of the school places. what year was the funding done until? Because all the modelling I've seen for school places up to 23-24. I'm hoping it's after 23-24.
In terms of the requirement for school places, the modelling does go some way into the distance. I can't remember the exact date, but in terms of so there's two parts to the modelling. There's the school places forecast, and then the other part of the modelling is the separate DFE tool that says, based on your need in a relatively short time frame, I think over the next 3 to 4 years, what do your places look like versus the number of children that you forecast will be coming into that education provision. So there's a separate tool to try and model the financial side of the funding you might get, and there's an internal forecast in relation to modelling the children and the places. So, and there are over 2 different timescales, because government funding is only awarded, or at least, I say awarded, provided indicatively 2 to 3 years ahead. So our expectations are that the 10 million that I've spoken about here is that 7.9, I think it is, might be available in 1920, and the balance in 2021. It is written in the capital report, actually. Can't find the page number.
That's okay. Thanks for that, Scott.
That's nice, no problem. Do we have any other questions? I'm going to take that as a no. Thank you for your time, Chris. Much appreciated. You can go back to doing other things. And that's the end of scrutiny management, and I will see you all on Tuesday.